Welcome to the Natasha Helfer Podcast. To help keep this podcast going, please consider donating at natashahelfer.com and share this episode. To watch the video of this podcast, you can subscribe to Natasha's channel on YouTube and follow her professional Facebook page at Natasha Helfer, LCMFT, CST-S. You can also find all her cool resources at natashahelfer.com. The information shared on this program is informational and should not be considered therapy. This podcast addresses many topics around mental health and sexuality and may not be suitable for minors. Some topics may elicit a trigger or emotional response, so please care for yourself accordingly. The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed by our guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views or feelings of Natasha Helfer or the Natasha Helfer Podcast. We provide a platform for open and diverse discussions, and it is important to recognize that different perspectives may be shared. We encourage our listeners to engage in critical thinking and form their own opinions. The intro and outro music for these episodes is by Otter Creek. Thank you for listening.
Hello everyone, and welcome to the Natasha Helfer Podcast, where we think shame is lame and we go after it anywhere we can. I think that's going to be my new entry.
It should, absolutely, 100%.
That'll be my little tagline for this podcast. I'm super excited to have Danny Lamoreaux with us today. He's actually one of our new providers at Symmetry Counseling. And for the first time ever at Symmetry, we're going to have a clinical psychologist on the team who not only can offer basic general therapy services that most people are familiar with, but who will also be able to serve our clientele with psychological evaluations. And I know from being in the field for as long as I have been that it can be difficult to get into somebody for a psychological evaluation. It can take, months of waiting, and it can be hard to know who to go to and whether or not the person you go to will understand certain aspects of your identity and all that kind of stuff. So I'm super excited to have brought you, Danny, onto the team. And I'm just going to give a little bit of a bio, and then I'd love for you to introduce yourself further. But Danny obtained his Bachelor's of Science in Psychology from Brigham Young University, so we have that in common, and his PhD in School Psychology from the University of Arizona. Although Danny has initially spent his career evaluating and supporting K through 12 students up until now with both emotional, behavioral, and developmental disabilities, a personal midlife crisis reignited a deeper calling within him, prompting him to obtain his general psychology license and pursue a path in therapy as well. Your approach is primarily based on the principles of acceptance and commitment therapy, which is an awesome modality, especially when we're working with folks that we tend to attract around issues with sexuality, issues with religious upbringings, issues with all kinds of sometimes behavioral things that people tend to be kind of down on themselves about. So that is great. And he is available for telehealth, and he's an LGBTQIA2 Spirit Plus advocate and ally. And so, that's what I have to say about you. So now what do you want to say about yourself? Tell us more about you, Danny.
Thank you, Natasha. I'm really stoked to be part of Symmetry Counseling. I'm stoked to have this opportunity just to sort of put out there my story, my passion, and hopefully help people know a little bit about what I can do to help. I would start with my personal background. I really feel like it's important to, the hugest thing in mental health, in getting help with mental health, or even if it's just evaluation, I think the hugest thing is rapport between whoever you're going to see, as a client, as a on the receiving end. I think you want to feel comfortable with who you're working with. And so, I don't know, to me, you can't divide the therapist from themselves or from their personality, from their background. And so I'm really open. And so my way of approaching therapy, but also just life with my relationships is just pretty much out there. I don't try to hide who I am. I'm not comfortable doing that. Maybe used to, right, as a young person, but I'm getting to that point where it's a waste of time. So here's who I am. I was raised in the LDS church. Really tried so hard to be a good Mormon boy. I'm introverted. I'm I tended toward that people pleasing and just doing what other people expected, because I really wanted I didn't want to let people down, and so I did all the things right in the church, served my mission, was happy to, and worked hard at it, and felt like a pretty, diligent missionary for the LDS Church. I returned home, got married in 3 months because my wife had waited for me. She
Oh,
actually
wow.
she converted to the church when I was in the missionary training center.
Oh, wow.
And so we got married and went to BYU, all the things. I actually started I did like community college stuff first, but then like started my true university level education at BYU Hawaii. So we were there for a while and then transferred and finished my bachelor at BYU Provo. Um, so so through that, and then like did, like as you mentioned, I came back home. Tucson, Arizona is home. It's where I was raised. So I came to Tucson for grad school to do my doctorate, in more of like a school psychology track, which is like it's a program of training and education that's focused on the application of general psychological research and principles to a school-based K-12 setting, so a lot of special education stuff. But they also, train generally for therapy, so that when you leave grad school, you can pursue a general psychology license if you want, which I knew I kind of wanted to do eventually. So I spent 6 or 7 years doing school-based psychology. And during that time, it was very soon very early in my career, actually, that I was feeling like the general sense of like there wasn't enough fulfillment, there wasn't meaning there. And I kept doing battle with the thoughts of like, that I should just kind of stick with this. This is what I trained for or whatnot. And my family needs stability. My wife and I have 4 kids, so we were, having to kind of do what we needed to focus on the finances. But like ultimately, I realized I got into psychology. I got interested in it originally because I knew I wanted to be what I now just call a healer. Right? I want to help. I want to be there for people. That was it. So that's why I was just like, yeah, I need to get back to my original plan. I realized I had deviated through. I could go back and remember the time period when I was finishing my bachelor's and I was thinking about grad school, like where do I go? What specialization or like what kind of psychology do I want to look at? And I remember the period of time where I like was hearing that clinical psychology programs, graduate training programs were like really competitive. And I knew like for me, I've never been an achiever. I'm always like, what can I do to do the minimum? Or like, but not only that, it's fear-based, right? It's like, what if I fail? And that's what I like awoke to, is like, I've been doing this kind of school-based psychology stuff because I was afraid of failing as a clinical psychologist, as a therapist. And it was time to return back to home, to myself, and trust myself and kind of take that leap, betting on myself. So that's been like the main reason for my shift away from school-based practice to more clinical-based practice. It's really just honoring what I think I'm meant to bring to the world. That was, it took several years to kind of to get to that, but also like there were logistical and practical reasons. It's just like I needed some extra postdoctoral hours in order to even apply for my license. So that eventually that all fell into place due to like a colleague that kind of came into my life and was able to provide those hours. And so like I just got my license for the State Board of Arizona last year, 2024, and then applied for my PsyPact. That's a thing that psychologists have, this like interstate agreement where, if they've passed certain legislation, a psychologist can provide telehealth services in other states that have that legislation and have agreed. There's like 40 some odd states that currently have that legislation, so I can cover most of the United States. There's still some that are not on board. There's still some that are currently working on the legislation, but it hasn't been like approved or whatever. I don't know government terms.
Yeah.
But anyway, yeah, so I can help a lot of people potentially. I just right now I'm twiddling my thumbs, so I'd love anybody who hears this and wants to uh, do some self work together. I think I would love it. It would be awesome. So that's like career stuff. I didn't so sprinkled in there with like my career midlife crisis of like needing to return to my true like career calling, vocational calling. Sprinkled in with that is of course like my spirituality and like how that's developed and grown. And like through my early adulthood, I was just grappling with all like the perfectionism and sexual shame stuff that was inculcated, as you grow up in the LDS or any Orthodox kind of Christian faith.
Mm-hmm.
And so having to go through that personal work and actually just didn't make any progress. Like nothing helped me feel like I was meeting the standards of my faith, of how they taught me like I needed to be with my sexuality. And so like I think that continued failure is what also catapulted me towards spiritual and faith expansion, because I was in this place of like I'm not enough, nothing I can do is enough to get me to fix me, quote unquote. And I even have a degree in psychology, still can't fix myself. Maybe there's a different approach. And eventually like, I got enough for me that they felt like spiritual promptings, but also intellectual growth, right? Which helped me realize like it's love. That's what I'm missing, right? If I don't love myself, if I don't start from a place of grounded in loving who I am and trusting myself, I mean that then I'll never be able to love others the way that they deserve to be loved. I won't be the psychologist that I want to be. There's just so much that it came down to like nothing. If I finally realized like that was it. Like I don't need to do any other self work except figure out how to love myself and kind of like have some pride in who I am, and just inherently like I don't even need to try. It's just I'm already. And I'm still, honestly, like I think, honestly, that's going to be the lifelong journey. That's now like my North Star. It's something that I don't even anticipate. It's not a goal. It's not an achievement. Like, oh, I love myself now. I think it's like, it's the process of continuing to come back home to yourself, come back to your center and remember it. Like, cause I think I still feel like most of my life is lived in that place of, self-doubt, but like I now just don't let it stop me. Right now I'm just ready to like commit to living who I'm supposed to be, even though there's so much saying that no, you can't do it. Nah, this isn't who you are, and like all this self-talk that was a part of my childhood. So that's the other piece of like the spiritual dimension of like my vocation, my career as a psychologist isn't about some intellectual pursuit. I definitely have like a piece of me that loves learning and loves understanding and knowledge and constantly chasing the next book and the next thing to learn. But there's also a huge piece of me that just genuinely, I just want to contact other humans in a deep, vulnerable way. Like I don't think there's anything else that matters in life more to me. I think if I had to let go of every other source of pleasure or fulfillment in life, as long as I can like connect deeply with other humans and see the inmost of people's depths and like who they are, that is the most like nothing else matters to me really if it came down to it. So that's why I'm in this. This is what I'm here for.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for opening up and sharing a lot of vulnerable information about your own journey into psychology land. A few things, if you don't mind, I'd like to kind of hone in on, because I just think they're awesome and probably would resonate with a lot of the listeners, is, this sense of loving self within our religious tradition of Mormonism that we both come from, but we see this also in, like you mentioned, a lot of high demand religions and more orthodox religions. It's interesting, I think, the juxtaposition. Like on the one hand, I grew up, singing songs like I am a child of God, I am loved by heavenly parents, who created me and want what's best for me, and so all these kinds of things that you would think, well, wow, if that's the philosophy or the theology, why would we not love ourselves? Why wouldn't it, land deeply from an early age that we are loved? And even as a young woman, we would, spout these values every week, like I'm of divine worth and I'm a daughter of God, and so you would think that the culture was really instigating, or I guess instilling a sense of self-worth. And I think in some ways that's true. I think in some ways my self-worth went with those kinds of messages was helped. And yet we know through working with so many folks who come from this tradition that self-love is really not something that I, as a therapist working with people who come from high demand religions, would say that we do well at. In fact, there's a lot of self-criticism, there's a lot of perfectionism, there's a lot of kind of hypervigilance to make sure we're doing everything right. You started by saying I was a bit of a people pleaser, which I think we're all people pleasers, because if you're not a people pleaser to some level, you're a sociopath. Right. But when it's like overly, it's overly exaggerated to the point that we martyr ourselves or self-sacrifice ourselves. As you were talking, I was like, I don't know that we really got the message that we ourselves are actually worthy of love. It's that if you fit into a certain box and if you earn it, if you're obedient enough, right? If you agree with the external's authority of how that authority feels you should be, then you get love. Then you've earned it. Right. And even it's not that long ago, I think just maybe was it 2 or 3 years ago that the prophet of the Mormon Church, Russell Nelson, did have a talk where he actually explicitly said, there is, God does not have unconditional love for, his people, that's something that is, his love is conditional. And I think we did receive a lot of those messages in Mormonism, that the Spirit will withdraw from you if you're not doing the right things, if you're not doing the right ways. And so then when you start looking at the wide diversity of how humans show up in this world, but there's only this one little box you can fit into to feel quote unquote worthy. And what's so interesting about that is I've talked to so many people who would, I think on paper, fit all the things of the box, like they're doing all the right things and they're making all the quote unquote right decisions, but they still don't feel like that internal love. We have a problem, right? We have a problem. And that's really leads to so much of the work that we're doing with folks that you and I like to work with. So I've really loved this language of you becoming self-aware enough to say, there was a few things you said that I could come home to myself. That was beautiful language. That I could take a bet on myself, right? So there's like a risk there in that language, right? That I can take a risk into believing in myself. And then you also mentioned the word pride, that I can be proud. And we have a wonky relationship with that word. Right?
Yeah, it's still hard to use that word for me. Like I don't know if I'll ever get over it. Yeah. So I think one of the things that I, as a group practice owner, that I enjoy is, of course, interviewing people who maybe want to come and work for us. And I'm always looking for these kinds of folks who have, at some level, wrestled with themselves, with some of the themes that so many of the clients who are attracted to symmetry counseling are also wrestling with, because I think there's something good about having that somewhat of it. I mean, none of us have the same shared experience, but we have shared themes, in our experiences, and it can be nice to have that understood. So anyway, do you have any reactions to what I'm just basically like telling you my thoughts of what you shared about yourself? Yeah, no, it's spot on, and I think the only thing that comes that would like to add to it is just like I think there's a definite there's interaction effects when you're like, so there's a reason that people respond differently to their faith-based upbringings, or like the religion that like people, two different people from the same religion can have very different relationships to it, because like there's obviously we're born genetically different, so like I do feel pretty strongly that personality colors the way the messages that you receive at church. I think a lot of us are predisposed to hear shame in the messaging because there's mixed messaging. You were just talking about, right? Like there's messages of like, yeah, God loves you. And unconditionally, right? And sometimes it's not, but like for the most part, the message in our faith growing up is like, God loves you no matter what. And yet there's all the messaging around like worthiness is this checklist. Mm-hmm. And so there's subtlety here, but there's two different messages happening. And so when a brain has two different conflicting messages, I do feel like it'll probably default to whatever one feels most like it's already aligned with what the person is already attuned to.
Yeah.
Based on their upbringing, their parenting, and their personality. So there's definitely different ways, and that's why I think some people just don't come into conflict with their faith at any point. They can be, true to the faith their whole life, and I think that's beautiful if it works for them. I do think there's maybe just a timeline where at some point they are going to need that therapy for their religious traumas and things. They just haven't come to light. And part of me feels like that's probably the case for everybody, but I'm also open to the fact that maybe not. Maybe just like in life, yeah, there's such a diverse array of humanity that like for some people it works and it's beautiful and great. And then there's a lot of us like myself who just be due to so many different factors, genetics and personality, that like, yeah, the primary message you do receive is that you're not enough. And you'll probably never be because it's the proverbial dog chasing your tail with spiritual perfectionism, right?
Yeah.
For truly perfection, what you're chasing, good luck. You're just going to keep chasing it until you stop and decide, enough is enough, and you're a beautiful person right now, and that and in fact that your imperfection and your struggles make you beautiful. That's the other, like the biggest part of my revelation in my spiritual journey, and then that colors the way I do therapy and practice, is this idea that like and this is a very common, it's almost becoming cliche now, right? But like your imperfections are your beauty, right? Like your struggles are what like give you this source of spiritual genius to or this source of like, it can be, right? Like if you come into terms with the gifts that struggle gives you, and how like darkness can be beautiful, and how whatever it is, whether it's depression, anxiety, whether it's getting self-doubt, but like these things they push us, right? They push growth. Like you need these things for growth. And so like without them, I think life is flat. And so that these dark sides these shadows of ourselves give our life meaning. I think they give us direction. They give us reasons to keep going. If we can figure out that framing. Yeah. At least that's what it is for me, so that's also kind of like the lenses through which I look at clients.
Yeah,
right? It's like, how is this hard part of you, this super tough part of life, how can we see? I mean, it's beautiful, right? Like it genuinely makes you such an admirable person, that you're still here, that you're still going, you're still showing up. So that's kind of huge too, is what like coming to those terms with my own journey, then kind of like that's what I'll be bringing to to folks that I'll be seeing, you know?
Yeah. 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 And I think when we think about when you were saying, you know, that some people feel traumatized by their religion and some people feel edified by their religion. And even as we talk about that, that's a binary, you know, like either you are or you're
Good
not.
point. Thank you. Oh, yeah. That is a binary. Mm-hmm.
Well, and that's my thoughts is, you know, I wish we could all, I think most of us, you know, that grew up in religious backgrounds could probably think of a few things that were helpful about that. And I think most of us could probably, if we really were non-defensive, could think about ways that we've been harmed. And
Oh,
so
yeah.
I always like to try to remind everybody that like trauma
It's
is just
weird.
like life, right? Like trauma is just part of life. And as long as you're interacting with imperfect people, regardless of whether they're the ones raising you or they're the ones at church with you or they're the ones in Mormonism with you, there's still going to be traumatic aspects, relationships, of things that happen, of abuses. But even psychologically, you know, I think we all have things. So I think, I agree with you that I think sometimes when I hear people say, oh, I don't have any religious trauma, it's only been helpful, I tend to have the bias that, well,
there's maybe an undiscovered shadow lurking.
Right. There's potentially something you haven't been willing to explore or even know how to explore.
Yeah.
And the same, you know, on the other side of the lens, right? Like, so it's I like messy.
Yeah, and even if you say the only gift, even if you say the only gift that religion gave you was like a life crisis, or you know, the inevitable fall and deconstruction, that's important because, like, I think the more rigid you were with your former life perspective, for me it was religion, like that. The greater the harder the reset, like in a good way, right? Like it forces you to really kind of reset everything about your life and kind of start fresh, because that's like an important part of human development, is to have the ego have enough structure and support. That fragile, sensitive, scared part of yourself, it needs enough support to be able to then like eventually step out on your own and self create and self construct, self develop. But first, the ego needs structure, and that's the blessing curse that religion often gives people. It's like it helps you feel stable until it totally all collapses, and then you get to build your own life. So I think that's really, I mean, I know that's, for some people, maybe that's helpful to understand. For others, you know, there's maybe a time in life where like it's not, you know, something we don't really want to think about how that was important and necessary. But frankly, like from a developmental, psychological development perspective, like you do need some structure in that fragile sense of self that you have up there that is like always needing some reassurance, and the certainty of salvation and the certainty of goodness and worthiness that you can't get internally yet, because there's no internal, you just don't have that internal integrity yet, right? Like you're still kind of working to figure out who you are. So now you can let that outside structure and that religion or that whatever it is, that life program that you follow, that kind of gives you the structure until you're ready to develop your own internal structure. Okay, so that was kind of like the rambling version of like why I think religion can be useful in a kind of negative, positive way. Right? And the reason that I still take my kids to church and at the same time try to prep them for someday this may not work for you. So.
Yeah, that's awesome. Braxton's listening. Hi, Braxton. I love Braxton. Anyway, he's saying the structure the ego needs makes so much sense the way you're explaining it. I love that. So he's, you may not know him, but he's one of our fellow colleagues in the Salt Lake area. He's a therapist and happens to be a sex therapist too. So I love him. Anyway, okay, well, let's take all of that now and dive into psychological evaluations. So
Yeah.
Because I think this is an interesting intersection, right, between religious trauma, sexuality, mental health, disorders or personality traits that all can really impact a person's view, a person's relationships, a person's treatment plan. Oftentimes, when I'm referring to a psychological evaluation, is because I've been working with somebody for 6 months or a year, and I just don't know that we're making progress quite the way we thought we might. Or so I start thinking, well, what am I missing? And where are my blind spots in the assessment of this particular person? And so then I'm usually saying, hey, would you be willing to look into having a more in-depth look at yourself through a psychological evaluation lens? So let's just start with, what is it? What is a psychological evaluation? How do you explain what it is, how they came to be, what types of, information go into it that makes it trustworthy?
Right. Yeah, well, we've come a long way since Freud's evaluation and assessment methods, and not that none of that has any validity. There's still psychodynamic practitioners and people that can really do a lot of good and help with those lenses. But what I'm saying is it's really evolved into a very data-based approach. Mm-hmm. Psychology as a social science tries to be as data-based and evidence-based and empirical as possible. Obviously, there's some squishiness and softness to it compared to microbiology and chemistry, but the idea with a psychological evaluation is to take multiple sources of data and create and formulate a picture of a person's, of their thinking, of their behavior, and life in a way that informs something about the dysfunction or the impairment in their life. I mean, we all have it. Whether it's enough to get a disorder or diagnosis labeled on you is one thing. But yeah, I mean, everyone experiences challenges in life. And so psychological assessment and evaluation are about exploring these things in a more standardized and data-based approach, rather than just what do you think, or what does my mom say is going on, or every bit of data and input, even from your mom, that's good data. But we got to look at a big picture, and psychology has developed standardized assessment tools, questionnaires, rating scales, IQ tests, and things that are psychometrically validated, meaning there's been done research or clinical trials or different ways of ensuring that these instruments, the way that they're designed, actually does help distinguish a person with impairment in this realm, or clinically significant anxiety. It helps distinguish them from people who may be not having clinically elevated levels of anxiety. So we use all these data-based approaches that try and form a picture of what's going on, what's under the surface of awareness sometimes. Yeah.
Yeah, and a question that comes up, I don't know why, right away, is I know that sometimes people wonder, well, is there, especially if, maybe I have a couple and maybe we're wondering about personality disorder or something along those lines. And sometimes some people say, well, can't they just dupe the test? Or is it, can't people just kind of wily their way around it?
Self-diagnose?
Yeah. Or even they're yeah, I don't want them to know this about me, right? So I'm just, not answer the ways that maybe I would normally. Is there any issues that you see with that kind of stuff?
Well, so in falsifying or trying to what we call malinger, we have this funny fancy word. It just means you're lying. But yeah, there are the specific tools that we use. For example, the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, which is just a huge, broad, here's all the traits of your personality. There are psychometric pieces designed into the questions that are in the assessment that the person answers, that are designed in a way that it picks up on people who are trying to malinger, people who are trying to excessively paint themselves as better than, more functional and successful than they really are, or even the opposite. It can also pick up on, in the pattern of their responding, it picks up on whether someone may be making themselves look like they're disordered or impaired when they may not be. And then there are a variety of validity. So they're called validity scales, right? For specifically to like questionnaire based self-report. So those help the clinician, but you got to, you kind of do have to know how to interpret these things. You can't just like, look at the number. You have to have the training to be able to know how to interpret those scores and scales that you get that are outputted when a person takes this kind of assessment.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. That's good. Well, I know that you had prepared, I'm sure there's 500,000 reasons that a psych eval might be helpful, but I know you had prepared like 5 or 6 reasons that you wanted to cover today. So let's dive into that. What are some good reasons to get a psych eval?
Yeah. So, I mean, number one, just very broadly, right? Like to have some clarity and understanding around your challenges. Like I said, we can, I mean, even this is something that comes from my own personal experience too. Like we can think ourselves in circles around like what, why am I struggling with this or that? Why do I go through relationships like crazy? Or why am I still stuck? Like what's going on here? So whether that's a child struggling in school, whether that's adults with attention, mood, or relationship challenges, the evaluation goal it's really driven by their own questions too, right? Like, when a person is going to come to me for an evaluation, it's really about what are your questions? If you don't have questions, I don't know how much I can help you, right? Like, so it's taking those questions and then really drilling down, maybe honing the question to something that I can address via evaluation and assessment. So we want to create a picture of strengths, weaknesses, and then like what are those underlying root causes of, whether it's your thinking patterns or your personality traits that are kind of causing you to struggle that may not be obvious to you or others. So that's one thing.
Yeah. So clarity in understanding different aspects of yourself that may not be always in conscious awareness. Right. I know that for so many people that I've worked with, I just had a fairly recent client get one in the last 6 months, and she was just over the moon. She was like, oh my gosh, so many more things make sense. Like there's so many things that are validating my life experience, both ways that I do feel I do well and things I struggle with, and now I have like explanations, and
right,
it almost feels like people respond to this. I hate to even say this word because it probably has stigma with it, but it's almost like a horoscope, but actually based in real science.
Yeah. Like here's a picture of here's a description of who you are generally, right? Like there's only so much that like human behavior doesn't always, not every choice you make matches up with your values and with your personality. Like we definitely act out of character sometimes, but in general, we can paint sort of a broad picture that helps validate who you feel you are too. It's like, I think we have a tendency, some of us are really like so obsessed with self-awareness that it's almost like we go too deep and we're too close to, it's right here and you can't be objective. Of course, no one can be. So sometimes it helps to have someone else outside to kind of help you. So that's definitely useful. And then another reason for evaluation is to drive interventions and treatment. So like, I think for the most part, like all good and experienced therapists doing mental health treatment, like can kind of like put pieces together as they get to know the client, and come up with some good treatment, ideas and like identify the key issues. And sometimes, and often that can be the case. Some clients, or people receiving therapy might be a little bit harder to sort of sift through everything. And so evaluation can kind of try and get to a level of specificity with like what are the key drivers of the maladaptive behavior or challenge. So I think it can be useful for like at the start or even like in the middle of therapy if a person is stuck and they've been with a therapist for a while. but definitely out the gate, like it can really jump a lot of steps of like the therapist coming to understand that client over time. Rather than that, it can be compressed into a short period of like, here, let's do this evaluation, and like here's a ton about, you know, this person. Obviously there's some anecdotal stuff that you just gotta have, that's just not going to show up, you know, that qualitative input and the person's own descriptions of their struggles. But that's also part of the evaluation process. So like, yeah, once we kind of have this picture of the person's profile with the evaluation, it can help identify the key issues to work on in therapy.
Yeah.
So
yeah, I would say, especially when there's comorbidity on board, which that's a fancy word. It's funny when you say like we have all these fancy words for basically just basic words. So comorbidity just means you have more than one diagnosis on board, you know. So somebody may come in, for example, with a very clear presentation of, let's say, some CPTSD around religious trauma. And I pick up on that very quickly, you know, it's kind of my niche. Right. But maybe I'm totally missing down the road that there's like maybe an OCD component to that, you know, that I'm just seeing through the lens of kind of typical perfectionism that wouldn't necessarily qualify for an actual OCD diagnosis yet, but I've missed it, you know, or some learning disability that's not even my forte, you know. And so both the client or maybe myself are frustrated about why are we not making progress, but there's some type of way that folks have cognitive functioning that's different than maybe what I'm typically used to, or some neurodiversity, you know, that is not totally aware of. There's so many things that you can be like, oh, this is the primary diagnosis, you're depressed, right? Or you have generalized anxiety disorder, but there could be other things that are also coloring, and the treatment plan isn't necessarily covering all of that.
Yeah, the old humans are onions. Thank Shrek for that metaphor, I think. Right, we have layers, and for sure some of us have multiple things happening that are, one issue can mask another, and I agree, yeah, it can be useful for that as well. And then another point I wanted to kind of talk about for the other side of after the evaluation is completed, and like the practical implications of how do we use this information. I mean, not only therapy, right? That's a big one, but just like education and workplace planning, you know, for kids, because I can take kids in K through 12 if people are interested in like developmental or intellectual disabilities or autism or learning disabilities, all this stuff I can do, but for kids, but even also for adults in the workplace, like identifying if you've got a diagnosis that is at play or any form of disability. You know, there's the Americans with Disabilities Act, and so like there's a lot of employers that are going to be required to, if you've got an identified diagnosis and disability, you can ask for accommodations. You know, so at work, if you're struggling with some aspect of it, they need to provide accommodations for your disability, and so like identifying those in a formal way then kind of puts that onus on the employer to help accommodate your needs if it's impacting you at work. So there's that, and then for kids at school, right? Definitely having a mental health condition can impact kids in school.
For sure.
And you need what's called either a 504 accommodation plan, or if it's actually affecting their ability to learn in a typical way in the general education environment, they may need special education support. Now there's a whole process, right? The special education department in public schools is tasked and legally bound to identify those needs. But if you need a second opinion, or if there's like a feeling that there's more going on that you want to explore with psychological assessment methods that aren't necessarily used in the school, I could have a conversation with folks about that in a consult fashion with a free consultation. So yeah, so there's some other good reasons, right? Helping with school-based supports, workplace supports, kind of recommending those things. So
yeah, and that's super important. I mean, if you've got ADHD or anything like that, especially if you're going to college, most universities now have great accommodations, but you do need the diagnosis and you need the the paperwork, I guess, to back you up for those things to happen. So That's another great use of psych evals. Okay.
Yeah.
Let
me hit you with another. So we already sort of talked about comorbidities, right? And sometimes having more than one diagnosis. So, and sometimes it's both, or sometimes it may actually be one that manifests or presents like the other condition. Like, frankly, like sometimes ADHD and having like, like thoughts that go really fast versus anxiety. And sometimes anxiety feels like racing thoughts. And so like, there's so the differentiation between conditions that may actually be separate and maybe only have one or the other is another way to sort of approach psychological assessment. There's also, since we were talking about school, like if kids are in school or college, like kind of diving into, is the child having a learning challenge, like cognitively, or is it a motivational or emotional things like that are interfering with their ability to focus on learning?
Mm-hmm.
So the evaluation could help sort out what's driving the like functional issue. So that's also kind of something to consider. One of the things that is maybe surprising to some people, but those who have some experience with maybe family members with ADHD or autism, is like ADHD can sometimes actually look like autism. There's a lot of kids with ADHD or even adults with ADHD that have sensory differences or sensitivities. And so they feel like maybe it's autism because autism has that strong sensory component. But like those are tough. Even like I continue to be challenged when I'm looking at kids or adults with ADHD and or autism. You can have both, right? But there are times when it's really tough to tell the difference without some formal assessment.
Yeah. It's so interesting. As you're talking, I'm just thinking about the word rumination itself, right? As a symptom, which rumination just means kind of like repetitive thinking. Mm-hmm. Is hard to turn off, ding, 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 ding. It's kind of like, that's my visual for rumination. Ding, 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 ding. and I can think of like, PTSD, generalized anxiety disorder, depression, ADHD, being on the spectrum, you can get rigid thinking about certain things, OCD, what is there a diagnosis that does not maybe include some rumination, right? That could potentially be symptoms, right? So, it's on many of them. And so it is, I'm just trying to like second your point that you can assume, oh yeah, I've heard this, or I just recently watched a TikTok that talked about this one symptom. So that must mean I have this thing that the TikTok is talking about. But it could be, but it could also be some other things, right? And I think that's why we call a lot of times the field of psychology more of the art science, right?
Sure. That's fair.
Yeah. And why I think psych evals, at least in my clinical experience, have been so helpful, because when I'm in that space of like, there's so many pieces to this person's puzzle, and I feel pretty confident I've gathered these pieces, but I'm still feeling like I'm missing something. That is, well, first of all, I don't want to be the kind of therapist who can't say that, because that's like, you don't want a therapist who thinks they can't be wrong. You want a therapist who's willing to challenge their own thought process about what they're thinking about your case. But that's what I've learned. It's very helpful for me and for my clients to stay wondering what could these things actually be about. So
cool. Right. So I totally agree with all that. And then like for my final thought this morning is like, let's shift into the strengths here, because like in mental health fields, especially clinical psychology, when there's like abnormal psychology and looking at what's wrong with you, it tends to be the question, but that's really unfair. When we focus too much on that, we forget like how many innate strengths every human, I think, is endowed with. And so evaluation can be not only about finding the problems and identifying those issues, but highlighting areas of resilience and highlighting strengths that someone has, both cognitively and emotionally and personality wise. I think it's really important to like to really come to terms with your strengths and figure out how to play to them, right? Like there's so much about our society that is just all about like follow the program, man. Do if you're going to be this or you want to have this career, you have to do this pathway. There are some ways where like that can be true. Like definitely you can't practice psychology without a license. There's pros and cons to that system that you have to operate within. But like just in general, we have this society of limitations, of boxes, of systems, and I feel like that teaches us about like conformity. But like, if we really get down to it, like you have everybody has some beautiful strengths and they're different, you don't have to do things the way that everyone does them. So like when we do a psychological evaluation, especially if we're doing like cognitive assessment, then we get some really interesting information about your intellectual strengths and how you can use those to your advantage and play to those strengths in your educational pathway or in your career. Kind of can inform some of that as well. So I think that's also really interesting to consider, like discovering your strengths and having that balanced approach to like not just trying to figure out what's wrong with you, but starting to lean into again your self-love and like seeing how cool a person you are. So
yeah, I really love that. I mean, we kind of did that with we started off by doing the shadow and the light of religious trauma, and I think that's the true of everything, right? We have this and like even ADHD, like I've got a kiddo with ADHD, and yeah, it's been a struggle in certain aspects of their life, especially in the academic systems that we have. Yeah. And yet there's aspects of having ADHD that are very creative and very detail focused in a different way than we usually, reward in the American system. And so I've seen that really play out in amazing ways as they're developing themselves, especially professionally. So you really take almost all of these things and they have some strength-based positivity if we're willing to look at that. So
totally true. Yeah.
Okay. So great. Those were 5 great reasons. Clarity, driving interventions and treatment, which that's a big, I guess, thorn in my side is when I feel like people don't have correct treatment plans in place. Mm-hmm. Education and workplace planning, comorbidity. So figuring out, okay, are there multiple things here going on and differentiating between symptoms that can be similar for several diagnoses. And then the strength-based stuff, is great too. So let's just a few more. I know we're almost at the end of our time, but a few more questions. One is, what can people expect? What is a psychological evaluation? How long does it take?
Nuts and bolts.
Most people, when they think of therapy, they think of the classic 50 minutes. Sitting down and doing some talk therapy with somebody. What is this? What can people expect if they come to do?
Yeah. So there's always 2 to 3 sessions, because I'm always going to have like the intake where I get to know you, get to know your history, and start to refine your questions around what you are looking to get out of the evaluation. And then there's always going to be the feedback session where we go over the findings, talk about recommendations, talk about your strengths and your challenges. And of course, whether there's any diagnostic criteria met. So there's always those 2 bookends. And then in the middle, it kind of depends. There's some of the assessment methods I use are just like rating forms, questionnaires. And in that case, I would they're going to be a link emailed to them and they can do it on their own time. It depends on the client. Some clients I may want to sit with, over the screen to just make sure that we kind of complete the questionnaire according to the standardized procedures. But for the most part, it's just the questionnaire, answer the questions, multiple choice questions. So sometimes it'll be just the 2 sessions and then like questionnaires in between for the client to fill out. Other times it would be a 3rd session, like an in-person testing. So if I'm administering a cognitive assessment, and that can be done over telehealth. Nowadays, there's some great tools for that. Or if it's a minor under 18 and if the parent is looking for school-based concerns and things, like we might do academic testing, reading, writing, and math stuff. So that can also be done in person, but has to be done in vivo, right? So that would be like that in the testing kind of session. So and then prior to all that, like if there's like any question about what you're looking for, we can do like a 10 to 15 minute phone call, obviously at no cost, just to like talk about what kind of things I can explore with them and can I give them what they're looking for, so to speak. So that would be step 0 if that's needed, and then again the normal intake and history taking and questions and what are your challenges, and then kind of go from there and me determining a plan. And by the end of that intake session, it's like I would tell them, okay, here's the assessment tools that we're going to use, whether that's those rating forms or whether that's direct assessment methods.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
And I know that some people might have questions about, well, does insurance cover this? These, especially like the intake and outtake sessions, and I think the answer to that is yes, some do. And right now we're working on getting you credentialed, right, with some insurance companies to help with that. And of course, there's lots of people who do end up self-paying for some of these services as well. Is there anything you want to clarify about all of that?
Just that, like you said, I'm working on getting paneled with some insurances. Right now, it would just be, like bill out of network or cash pay for now. So yeah, the fees I have on, if you go to our Symmetry website and find my page, my like bio page, I think we have my evaluation fees list posted on that. So if you want to check out the kind of get a sense of the cost.
Okay, and I'll make sure to link that to the threads as well. And then and like you're saying, you're willing to sit with folks for like a 10 to 15 minute free consult to answer questions and see if this is what they're actually looking for.
Happy to do that.
And yeah, so that's great. Let's see. Any final thoughts about why this is important work, or any myths or stigmas that you want to address in regards to psych evals?
Yeah, I mean, I think we touched on it, but like the whole idea of labeling, I know can be averse to a lot of people, myself included. Like, it's funny because like okay, so shadow and light, right? Light and dark, right? When we provide a label or a diagnosis, we now have some direction on like how to help that person. The person gets more self-understanding and self-awareness and self-acceptance, right? Can be very validating for a lot of people. Mm-hmm. And then of course there's like the whole, well, when a person, there are some folks, I bet I would be one of those too, is like that once you have a diagnosis, you might box yourself in a little too much. You might assume that too many things in your life are because of your diagnosis, and limit yourself in terms of like what your potential is and what you're capable of, and creating your life. So my hope would always be that that's not what people are going to come away with, because evaluations aren't really about labeling. They're about getting clarity about your challenges. It's about giving you some direction. It's really about empowering the person to go forward and kind of tackle things. So that's how I would frame it, although I recognize the challenges of it, like, because there is a lot of stigma around certain diagnoses in particular.
Right.
And that that they're almost, what do I want to call them? Almost, like, oh, this is the rest of my life. It's just going to be defined by this thing. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But again, if we kind of have that strengths-based approach, which is my goal, then we would hopefully help people frame their challenges and their potential diagnoses in a way that is both enlightening and empowering, and not hopefully something that makes their life smaller, and more limited.
No, I totally agree with that. I think it's the whole yes and approach, right? Like, I remember my dad, I've talked about him several times throughout my podcasting, but he, realized he was on the spectrum late in life, like probably in his 60s, and he's a psychiatrist. So it's so interesting, right? That we can be our own, we can be within the field and know all the things intellectually, but still not know how to apply it to our own lives. So that was incredibly validating for him, especially with how many social challenges in particular he had. It was incredibly validating to us as a family system where, we had interpreted his personality, or for him to have certain quirks that were upsetting to us. And now it was like, oh, that makes total sense. And it was so helpful, not just for the individual, but I also think for family members to understand, like, well, these things that maybe I thought you were intentionally doing, or that you were doing because you don't care about me, or you're not prioritizing our relationship. Sometimes there's just like, no, these are just like kind of ways we show up as humans that we've storied, we've made meaning on that, but it's not necessarily accurate as to that's why this particular person is showing up in these patterned ways, right?
Yeah.
So it can be helpful that way. And yes, it can be, I've talked to a lot of people that feel like either they're discriminated against, or now, they see their entire lens through that psych eval. And this is where I was going to say to you too, like, this is why we want to incorporate these findings into therapy work, so people can have a more nuanced or flexible way to see the results. Yeah. And my guess is that you would be willing to do that as well, right? Like, it's not, I'm trying to think through dual.
Right. You're saying, so could I evaluate a client and then proceed to do therapy with them?
Right.
Yeah, because if nothing else, it advantages me to know how to better. But also, like, my hope is to set up a process in Symmetry with like our internal, with, if any of you out there are already Symmetry clients and you have a Symmetry therapist, I think it'd be so awesome to work together with your therapist if we do an evaluation process, even from both in the intake session, the first session, and the feedback session. There's just it would enrich the dialogue and the process so much to have the therapists all there work with you, if they've done if they've done extensive work with a person. So that would be invaluable as well, and really cool, because then I can hand the client off back to that therapist having been part of the conversations and part of the discussion, and then it would just I think it would help the therapeutic relations of other therapist and client relationships. So that's also kind of my vision for utilizing my services within Symmetry. I think it could be really cool in that way. Obviously, that'd be with the client's permission, right? We'd have a consent process to involve your therapist, but I think that covered. I think we covered like a good discussion here.
Too. I'm so glad we did this, because I'm super excited to have this at my fingertips with you as far as the access to somebody who gives these services or offers these services. And I hope people can understand how helpful it can be to the entire process, whether it's a spouse you're concerned about, whether it's yourself, whether it's a child, like a teenager, or even a elementary school kiddo who needs some extra support. It's so helpful to have this kind of information on board for folks. So thank you so much for coming on, Danny, and for spending your time with us today, and sharing so much also too about just your personal life. So, if anybody has any questions, reach out to simcounseling.com. You can also find me at natashahelfer.com, and we always welcome comments, or, in the Facebook threads, or even if you just want to reach out to us and let us know if you have other questions that you'd want answered. So thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of your weekend. Take care. And remember, shame is lame. Take care.
Shame is lame. Bye, y'all.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to the Natasha Helfer Podcast. To help keep this podcast going, please consider donating at natashahelfer.com and share this episode. To watch the video of this podcast, you can subscribe to Natasha's channel on YouTube and follow her professional Facebook page at Natasha Helfer, LCMFT, CST-S. You can also find all her cool resources at natashahelfer.com. The information shared on this program is informational and should not be considered therapy. This podcast addresses many topics around mental health and sexuality and may not be suitable for minors. Some topics may elicit a trigger or emotional response, so please care for yourself accordingly. The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed by our guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views or feelings of Natasha Helfer or the Natasha Helfer Podcast. We provide a platform for open and diverse discussions, and it is important to recognize that different perspectives may be shared. We encourage our listeners to engage in critical thinking and form their own opinions. The intro and outro music for these episodes is by Otter Creek. Thank you for listening.
There is a place where time slows to nature's pace, and there is space there to find yourself in her embrace. Some places should be left alone. Na tishki say the so we can always go to the homeland of the heart. Years of our human history etched on her canyon walls, alongside Earth's mysteries. Some places should be left alone. No tishki shade navu, so we can always go to the homeland of the heart, to the homeland of the heart. Deep in our cities, we sleep without her stars, yet still her presence sustains us from afar. Some places should be left alone. No tishki shade navu, so we can always go to the homeland of the heart, to the homeland of the heart, to the homeland